now to our first presentation. That's Dr. Sharmini Paramasivam. She's of the Animal Neighbours Project and the University of Surrey. And she's going to be talking about a nice project having to do with urban conflict with macaques. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you to the AFA Coalition team for inviting me to speak today. I'm really happy to share on this topic. My name is Dr. Sharmini Julita Paramasivam, and I'm a teaching fellow at the University of Surrey. I'm also the project lead for the Animal Neighbours project. To be able to share with you some of the work that we've done, some mitigation strategies for urban macaque issues that we carried out in Malaysia over. I can't be there live with you at the moment. It's way too early in the UK, but hopefully we can answer some questions and have a bit of a discussion during the workshop. So in my presentation today, I'm going to break it down into three categories. First thing, I want to highlight the situation in Malaysia, and how we went about designing the mitigation strategy. So what was the data that we collected? And lastly, we will delve into the strategies that were implemented, as well as some of the major challenges that we faced. So what is the current status in Malaysia is probably no different than many other countries. Our urban development is changing the natural habitat for macaques and other wildlife. And not only is it reducing the space, the overall space for their habitat, it's also changing the way the animals use these habitat. The second major issue is the feeding of wildlife, or this culture of feeding of wildlife that's rampanting in Malaysia. And this is a direct habit, as you can see from the photo on the top left-hand corner, where people actively purchase food, bread, fruits, and hand it out to the animals. Either it can be for entertainment or for tourist purposes, or it might be that they are genuinely concerned about the animals and want to feed them because they think they're far too thin. Whatever it is, the motivation behind it is not always a negative thing. It's actually a lot of times driven by a positive motivation and in hoping that they're doing something good for the animals, when actually it's quite the opposite. The other thing as well is the indirect feeding. So if you look at the picture on the top right hand corner, this is an indirect way in which the macaques get food through bins and performing natural behavior, things like foraging, what the macaque would deem as foraging, becomes a unnatural or is recognized as a pest behavior because of the consequences. So by going into the bin, there's a lot of rubbish that's left outside, and the mess then brings about rats. So there's a lot of issues brought about by this natural behavior by the macaques. For a long time, translocation was looked at as a solution, or it was a favorable option by many of the local community, but that's not always a feasible solution. So looking at the picture in the middle, or the bottom middle, that is members from the wildlife department, or perhilatan as they're known in Malaysia, and this is the number of people to translocate one or two macaques that were in a urban area. And this is where it becomes unrealistic, because it's a very high resource demand, where it takes up a lot of energy, manpower, finance as well, to translocate, and it's not feasible in the long term, especially when you're thinking about large numbers. But more importantly, by taking these animals and putting them in a different location, there's a large impact on the ecosystem, and you can't just move these animals without looking into this. So it's not really a realistic, feasible solution anymore, especially with the large numbers that we're talking about. And the The issue is also with the number of complaints. There's a high number of complaints by the public to the wildlife department. If you look at the chart on the right hand side, the bar graph, you may not be able to see the little details, but I just want you to focus on the first large red column that shows 4,850 complaints. Now, this was taken from the Wildlife Department's yearly report, and that's just complaints for one species. That was just the long-tailed macaques um, in 1 year. And that's a staggering number of complaints that they receive. What's the severity of the complaints, or what the breakdown of the complaints is? We do not have that information, and that's really crucial bit of information, because it might be one monkey that's causing a problem, and therefore people keep complaining about this one monkey, or it could be 30 monkeys or 50 monkeys. So it's important for us to to find out that information. The the more common thing that was done is to manage this problem was to cull large numbers of monkeys, and of course this brought about a large outcry nationally as well as internationally, that a better mechanism be found, or a better way to manage this conflict. So in 2013 there was a start of the outcry for something to be done, because it was reported 100,000 monkeys are culled in Malaysia on a yearly basis, and that's again a very large number. Um, More recently, people have started taking things into their own hands. So there's been a few reports of macaques being poisoned because of the numbers, or because the people feel uncomfortable with them. So nationally and internationally, there's been a big push for more change to happen. Just how this change goes about is the big question, and can be very tricky for everyone involved with this. So this is where we started off. We wanted to find out how can we go about trying to change this situation. And the first thing we needed to do was to answer those questions, to find out what were the numbers like, what was the major complaint. So we identified a couple of urban sites in Kuala Lumpur, and worked with stakeholders. And when I stakeholders, I mean residents. It could be shopkeepers, the local authority. So just whoever sort of involved or affected by this problem. And we ran community engagement workshops where we were merely the facilitators. So we just conducted the workshop and sort of steered the workshop, but it was really driven by the local community. So they identified what were the problems, they talked about the complaints, and they also worked on coming up with solutions. And what we did then was to break it down into, as you can see, the lower picture here, is we broke it down into what were the main problems, and what were the not so major problems to them, and what could be fixed easily, and what would be a long-term solution. So when you break it down in that quadrant, then you can quite easily identify what's a major problem that's easy to identify, or low-hanging fruits, as we call it. So by doing that, we then were able to identify some really key things that in all these different sites, and some of it, most of it actually were quite similar. One being this major problem of the macaques going into bins and causing a mess. So that was from the human perspective. We then also conducted some behavior observation, where we watched the macaques in these areas to see what the numbers were like when they came out, what was sort of driving that motivation for them to come out, and how it correlated with some of the complaints or some of the issues that were brought up during the workshop. Now, with that data that we collected, we were then able to come up with a more solid strategy, and have a more targeted mitigation strategy. So the first thing that we set out to do, which, as I said, was the first low-hanging fruit, was to try and put a stop to the motivation. And you see that I've put the word stop in quotes because you can't stop the motivation, because the motivation, as I said before, is natural. From the macaque's perspective, what they are doing is actually they're foraging for food, which is a natural behavior, and they spend large quantities of their time looking for food. Unfortunately, the space in which they're looking for the food is not appropriate, and making it unsafe for people. So simple things that we could do, if you observe pictures 1 and 4, this was a complaint that took place in a local university, where it was a very old building, so it had lots of open spaces for ventilation, which is great from a human perspective. But monkeys used to use that to come into the dormitory, which was really quite frightening for the students. So a quick fix to that was to seal that area off. And one major complaint as well was the monkeys coming in through doors that were not shut properly. So sometimes, students walking back and forth, and if they forget to lock the door, then a monkey can quite easily push through. And a quick fix to that was implementing one of those automatic door shutters. So when the door, if someone were to open the door, it would automatically sort of shut itself. And this is a really quick fix. And immediately, there was no complaint about the macaques entering that space. The other thing that we designed was a novel latch to shut the bins, um, so the macaques couldn't get into it. So we tested it and put fruits and food inside and left it out, and so we can definitely say it's macaque proof that they can't get into it, but people can still open it. So it's a two-way locking mechanism, and we implemented it in areas and tested it, and it seemed to work very well. Of course, it's not. It sounds really easy, but it's actually a lot of work because it requires a lot of cooperation. So it's talking to the local residents to make them aware about it, to show them how it's used, to have stickers to on the bins to show how you open it and shut it, but also to collaborate with the waste removal companies and the local authorities, so that they are aware about this and they don't get put off by the extra unlocking of the bins to remove the waste. And that seemed to work well. But of course, there are challenges to this. Of course, it's making sure that everyone in the area is using it. When you have this in one lane or jalan, um, of course the monkeys stop using the bins there, but they can easily move to the next road, because they can then access the bins. So the idea behind this is to make sure that if this is being implemented, that it's implemented in the whole area. So this is just more pictures again to show different bins. So this was in a park where it had an open slot, and the monkeys would go in to get the food. And what we did was just to put a heavy piece of metal that you can use as a flap, but it's quite a challenge to push for the monkeys, so they couldn't get in. And again, just some further pictures to show the engagement from the local community, which is key in getting activities like this successful. The next thing, of course, is to work at changing attitudes through awareness. So the idea behind the awareness campaign was to make it simple and have very, very clear messaging, so that it's easy to pick up and easy to understand. And we took it a step further and also provided reasonings behind why we gave this advice. So we felt that it's very different to say, do not feed the monkey, versus if you say, do not feed the monkey because ABC can happen. And we felt that this gives a more long-term understanding and a more long-term, deeper understanding of the problem, and therefore can actually change attitudes. So we had some fun activities with the public, just to get kids aware about what the species is, why feeding is bad, what you can do. Well, simple things like that, to more solid things like a signboard, which you see on the top left-hand corner, saying why you shouldn't feed the monkeys. We then took it another step further by making signboards, as the one on the left, with more of a flow chart approach. So it goes as in what happens if you feed the monkeys. Things like you'll see more individuals. The closer they are to people, they can catch diseases from people, and vice versa. They get more habituated. So it's more of a flow chart, and this was also put in public spaces where people sort of gathered so that they can stop and read this. There was also colorful, quick points on how to reduce sort of macaque, human macaque conflict or interaction. Um, and it was basically saying, 5 things. What are the 5 basic things that you can do? Don't feed the monkeys, keep your food sources secure, keep a distance, or even keeping them out. So we followed this up with a video to give an example. If there was, for example, people found that the macaques were moving from one tree to another, then trimming the trees so that the branches don't allow for them to connect could be a simple way to just reduce the monkey from coming into your area. So instead of asking for them or putting a complaint in for them to be taken away, try and figure out what's the why are they coming in to begin with. Then we also carried out some community reporting, and this was um, easy to begin with, but of course challenging to manage because it requires, again, resource and motivation. The good thing about this, it's a great way to collect data on what's happening with interaction and how successful or not the strategies that we implemented were during the lockdown period, because we were supposed to collect data, but of course lockdown happened and we couldn't. But it was still a manner in which we could still gather information from members of the public. It's important as well, so we know that if a strategy hasn't worked, we can then target our mitigation strategies a little bit more appropriately. Um, this it's a good way of finding out more details. So the two bar graphs on the left hand side shows information that we were basically a snapshot of some data that we collected or are still collecting. I mean, it's things like when the monkeys were seen, what were they doing, what time was it, which part of the residential area. So you can kind of draw a map on where they are and what time they're coming, and try and figure out what the motivation is, what's drawing them to the area. We also put in pictures so that they can identify, are they looking at the which monkey is it that they are spotting. So is it a langur, or is it a macaque, it's a long tail, pigtail. So that it's important to know if if you're putting in a complaint, that you know which species you're talking about as well. And it's a nice way to follow up and keep in touch with the community. Of course, the challenge of that can be, it requires a lot of resource. The last thing that we carried out that sort of stopped and wasn't very successful at it was we wanted to alter the behavior of these macaques using learning theory. And those of you from a behavior background will know that learning theory is the basis behind how you train animals, and the principles behind the training of animals, or even people. And what we wanted to do was to use a learning theory, or the ability of the animal to learn, to control its movement. So by introducing a stimuli, so a negative stimuli, that's not to the animal's preference, but doesn't hurt the animal, so it's not inhumane, and use it to teach. So I'll give you an example. So the picture there shows a sensor, a water spray sensor that's used for foxes in the UK. So this was purchased here and taken over to be tested in Malaysia. And every time the macaque would come around the area, the sensor would spritz water for 3 seconds. And that would tell the macaque that if you approach the area, then something negative happens. And so they back off and it stops. And again, it happens. So the idea is that they learn very quickly that there's a negative association if I cross a certain boundary, and if I move back, this thing stops. Okay, and we even tested it with sound, where if a macaque was within an area, there would be a sound like an alarm, and the minute they stepped backwards, then the negative sound stopped. So it was a motivation for them to sort of move away instead of move forward. Now, in theory, this all seemed nice, but of course, the challenge is to make sure that the timing is very, very precise. If not, the learning doesn't take place. So, for example, if you kept the water going, if the sensor was spoiled, or if you didn't stop the alarm in time, then there can be a negative association, and the animal doesn't learn that as it moves back, the negative thing stops. So having precise timing and consistency was key to this happening. And we slowly realized that that was not very possible if we didn't have the same people doing it. And if there wasn't training and proper training to all the people in the area. So it wasn't possible at this point. It was not a realistic approach at this point. But it's definitely something that I feel we should venture into and think about. Anyone who's interested in this, I'm very happy to have a conversation or try this out. I think it's a safe, humane manner in which we can try out to use learning theory that's used so often in other wildlife training. So that was what we've done in the past 2 years. Um, what's our future? To try implementing this in more test sites and to expand it to a larger area to see how successful it is and what's the impact of it long term. Because if it's successful in one area, what's happening is the monkeys moving to another area, and to learn what's going on um, in a long term. So think about more consistent long term data, and to be more active with the awareness. So, really being on the ball, and creating awareness consistently throughout the year, whether it's on social media or down on the ground. And of course, all of this requires finances, it requires staff, and the project would really like to invest in full-time staff members in Malaysia, so that the work can take place more consistently. But of course, that's dependent on getting more finances in. So that's it in a nutshell. I really want to thank the ANP team, the past and present members who have made this mitigation strategy implementation possible, and to just people who have just volunteers who have come and gone to keep the project going. It's made it what it is today. And a special thanks as well to the local action group, which without them and their participation and key consideration to want to make a change, this would not be possible. I also want to shout out to Perilitan and the Malaysian Primatological Society for cooperating. So Perilitan very much for the support that they and willing to work together with us, and MPS for allowing us to affiliate ourselves with them. So I'm really pleased with that. So thank you very much, and I will see you all at the workshop. Bye.
Thank you. That was really nice, really interesting, and good information about the importance of research and community engagement and human behavior change to trying to solve some of these problems. We're now going to move on. Oh, sorry. There again, I said to some of you earlier, there won't be a question and answer session right now, but in the workshop later, there will be plenty of opportunity for discussion. So now we're going to move on to Anbarasi Bhupal